4 children, a cabin at 10,000 feet, 15 miles to the nearest town, and no man coming to help. Sarah Harmon was 32 years old when her husband disappeared in the autumn of 1889, leaving her alone with 4 mouths to feed in a Colorado valley where winter does not negotiate. She had no family, she had no money, and she had no time for grief, because the first snowfall was already covering the mountain. The community knew she was there. But outsiders' problems are nobody's problems, and when the snow closes the roads, there is no doctor. There is no store, there is no rescue, only silence, and the decision of how much a mother is willing to risk when one of her children stops breathing right in the middle of the night. The next 5 months would teach Sarah Harmon something no church ever preached, that dignity does not come from being saved. It comes from refusing to fall. Before we go any further, tell me something. Where are you watching this from? City and country. I read every comment. Sarah Harmon was not born in Colorado. She was born in a small farming town outside Pittsburgh in 1857, the second daughter of a seamstress and a foundry worker who drank more than he earned. By the time she was 16, she understood that marriage was not romance. It was escape. And when Thomas Harmon appeared at her father's door in the spring of 1874, a railroad surveyor with steady work and a polite manner, she said yes, without hesitation. They married in June. By August, they were heading west. Thomas had been promised work with the Denver and Rio Grande Railway, laying track through the Rockies where the air was thin and the pay was decent. Sarah had never seen a mountain. She had never been more than 30 miles from the house where she was born. But she packed what little she owned into a single trunk and stepped onto the train with her new husband, believing that distance could erase the past. The journey took 9 days. She remembered the heat inside the rail car, the smell of coal smoke and unwashed bodies, the way her dress clung to her skin in the still air. She remembered the first time she saw the plains stretching flat and yellow under a sky so wide it felt like falling. And she remembered the moment the mountains appeared on the horizon, dark, jagged, impossibly high, and the cold knot of fear that settled in her chest. Thomas squeezed her hand. "It'll be good," he said. "You'll see." She wanted to believe him. They arrived in Leadville in late August of 1874, when the town was still half tent city and half wooden storefront, crawling with miners and railroad men and women who worked the saloons and boarding houses. Thomas found work immediately, and Sarah found a room in a cramped boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Kellerman, who charged $2 a week and didn't ask questions. For the first year, life was tolerable. Thomas worked long hours on the line, and Sarah took in mending and washing to help with rent. The altitude made her dizzy at first. The air felt thin, like breathing through cloth, but her body adjusted. She learned to boil water longer. She learned that bread didn't rise the same way. She learned that cold at 10,000 feet was a different animal than cold in Pennsylvania. By the spring of 1876, she was pregnant with their first child. Emma was born in January of 1877, in the middle of a blizzard that buried Leadville under 4 feet of snow. The midwife barely made it through the drifts. Sarah labored for 14 hours in a room so cold she could see her breath. And when the baby finally came, small, red-faced, screaming, she felt something crack open inside her that had nothing to do with pain. She had a daughter. She had a purpose. Thomas kissed her forehead and promised things would get easier. But they didn't. The railway work slowed. The company began laying off men in waves, and by the summer of 1878, Thomas was scrambling for whatever jobs he could find, hauling freight, repairing fences, mucking stables. The money dried up. Sarah went back to washing clothes, this time with a toddler clinging to her skirts. And then, in the winter of 1879, she got pregnant again. The second child was a boy. They named him James. He was born too early, too small, and he died 3 days later in Sarah's arms without ever opening his eyes. She didn't cry at the burial. She couldn't afford to. By 1880, Thomas had found steadier work with a mining outfit near Granite, a small settlement 20 miles south of Leadville. The pay was better, but the work was harder, and he was gone for weeks at a time. Sarah stayed in Leadville with Emma, working, waiting, surviving. And then, in the spring of 1881, Thomas came home with an idea. "There's land," he said, "up near Twin Lakes. Good land, cheap. We could file a claim, build something, stop paying rent to people who don't give a damn about us." Sarah looked at him. "We don't have money for land. We don't need much. Filing fee's $14. We can build a cabin ourselves. I'll work the mines part-time, and we'll homestead the rest. Raise some chickens. Plant a garden. It's ours, Sarah. No landlord, no rent." She wanted to say no. She wanted to say it was madness to drag a 4-year-old child into the wilderness with no neighbors, no help, no guarantee of anything. But she looked around the boarding house room, peeling wallpaper. A single window that didn't close right, the smell of other people's lives seeping through the walls, and she realized she was tired of borrowing space in the world. "All right," she said. By June, they had filed the claim. 160 acres near the base of Mount Elbert, at the edge of a valley where the snow stayed late and the growing season was short. The land office clerk looked at Sarah with something like pity when Thomas signed the papers. "You know what you're getting into?" the clerk asked. Thomas nodded. Sarah said nothing. They moved in July. Everything they owned fit into a single wagon Thomas borrowed from a man in Granite. The road up to the claim was barely a road, more like a suggestion carved into the hillside by previous travelers. The wheels rattled over rocks and ruts, and Emma clung to Sarah's lap, wide-eyed and silent. When they finally reached the plot, Sarah climbed down from the wagon and stood in the tall grass looking around. There was nothing. No cabin, no well, no fence. Just land and sky and the cold wind coming down from the peaks. Thomas grinned. "What do you think?" She thought it looked like the end of the earth, but she said, "It's ours." They spent the next 3 months building. Thomas cut timber from the surrounding forest and hauled it back to the site on his shoulders. Sarah helped him frame the walls, her hands blistering and bleeding from the rough wood. They built a single-room cabin, 16 feet by 14, with a dirt floor and a roof made from split shingles that leaked when it rained. There was no window. There was a door that didn't hang straight, and there was a stone fireplace that Thomas built himself, cursing every rock into place. By October, it was finished. Barely. Sarah gave birth to their 3rd child in that cabin in the spring of 1882. Another girl. They named her Clara. And 2 years later, in 1884, came another boy, Jacob. 4 children now, 4 mouths. And Thomas still working the mines, still gone for days at a time, still coming home with less money than they needed. But they survived. Sarah planted potatoes and turnips in the rocky soil. She kept chickens. She learned to stretch a sack of flour for 2 weeks. She learned to patch clothes until there was more patch than cloth. And she learned that isolation was not silence. It was the sound of wind and her own thoughts circling endlessly. The neighbors were few and far between. The closest family was 3 miles away, a Norwegian couple named the Larsens, who nodded politely when they passed on the road, but never stopped to talk. There was a small church in the valley, but Sarah rarely went. The women there looked at her with suspicion, as if poverty were contagious. Thomas grew quieter. He drank more. He came home later. And then, in September of 1889, he didn't come home at all. Sarah waited 3 days before she rode down to Granite to ask questions. The mine foreman said Thomas hadn't shown up for his shift in over a week. No one had seen him. No one knew where he went. "Men leave sometimes," the foreman said, not unkindly. "It happens." Sarah rode back to the cabin in silence, her hands numb on the reins. Emma, now 12 years old, was watching the younger children when she arrived. Clara was 9, Jacob was 5. And little Daniel, born just the year before, was barely walking. Emma looked up at her mother. "Where's Papa?" Sarah dismounted. She tied the horse to the post, and she said the only thing she could say, "I don't know." The first snow came 2 weeks later. The snow came early that year. By the second week of October, the peaks were already white, and the air carried that particular sharpness that meant winter was not coming. It had arrived. Sarah stood in the doorway of the cabin and watched the clouds gather over Mount Elbert, dark and low, and she felt the weight of what was ahead settle onto her shoulders like a yoke. She had 4 children. She had half a cord of firewood. She had 2 chickens left. The others had been taken by a fox in August, and a sack of potatoes that wouldn't last past Christmas. She had no husband, and she had no plan beyond the next day. Emma came up beside her, wrapping a shawl around her thin shoulders. The girl had grown tall in the past year, her face losing the softness of childhood. She looked older than 12. She looked tired. "Mama," she said quietly, "what are we going to do?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She watched the wind bend the grass in waves, watched the first flakes begin to fall, small and dry, like ash. She thought about the mine foreman's words, "Men leave sometimes. It happens." As if Thomas had simply walked away from them like a man walks away from a bad hand of cards. Maybe he had. Or maybe something worse had happened, and she would never know. Either way, the result was the same. She was alone. "We're going to get through winter," Sarah said finally. "That's what we're going to do." Emma nodded, but her eyes stayed on the mountains. That night, Sarah went through everything they had. She pulled every sack, every jar, every scrap of stored food out onto the table, and counted it in the dim light of a single candle. 2 pounds of flour, a half-pound of lard, a small sack of cornmeal, 6 potatoes, a handful of dried beans, a jar of preserves Clara had helped her put up in the summer, wild raspberries, more sugar than fruit. It wasn't enough, not even close. She looked at the children, already asleep on the narrow bed they all shared, tangled together under 2 threadbare blankets. Daniel's small hand was curled against Clara's cheek. Jacob's mouth hung open, his breathing soft and even. She thought about the 15 miles to Leadville. She thought about loading the children into the wagon and trying to make it down the mountain before the snow got worse. But the road was already dangerous, and she had no money for rent, no place to stay, no work waiting for her. And even if she made it to town, what then? A woman alone with 4 children was not a tragedy people rushed to solve. It was a burden, an inconvenience. She had seen it before. Widows and abandoned wives passed from charity to charity. Their children farmed out to whoever would take them. The families scattered like seeds in the wind. She would not let that happen. So she made a decision. She would stay. She would ration what they had. She would make it last. And when spring came, she would figure out the rest. She blew out the candle and lay down beside the children, pulling the blanket up to her chin. The cold was already seeping up through the dirt floor, and she could feel the draft coming through the gaps in the walls. She closed her eyes, but she did not sleep. The snow fell steadily for 3 days. By the time it stopped, the cabin was surrounded by drifts that came up to Sarah's waist. The road, if it could even be called that, was gone, buried under a white blanket that stretched unbroken to the tree line. Sarah stood outside in the freezing air, her breath clouding in front of her face, and understood what isolation truly meant. No one was coming. No one could come. Even if someone wanted to check on her, even if the Larsons or the pastor from the Valley Church thought to ride up and see how the Harmon family was faring, they would take one look at that road and turn back. She was on her own. She went back inside and stoked the fire, feeding it carefully. Firewood was currency now. Every log she burned was one less log for later. She had to be smart. She had to be precise. Emma helped her move the table closer to the fireplace so the younger children could stay warm while they ate. Breakfast was a thin porridge made from cornmeal and water. Clara ate without complaint. Jacob asked for more, and Sarah gave him half of her own portion, her stomach already tight with hunger. Daniel, not yet 2 years old, cried. He didn't understand why the portions were so small. He didn't understand why Mama kept saying no. Sarah held him on her lap and rocked him until he quieted, his small body heavy with exhaustion. "It's all right," she whispered into his hair. "It's all right." But it wasn't. The days began to blur together. Wake before dawn, build up the fire, melt snow for water, feed the children, try to keep them warm, try to keep them quiet, try to keep them alive. Sarah rationed the food with a discipline that bordered on cruelty. A quarter cup of beans per person, 1 potato split 4 ways, a spoonful of preserves on Sunday if they had been good. Emma never complained. Clara tried not to. Jacob cried sometimes, his small face pinched with hunger, and Sarah held him and told him stories to distract him, stories about Pennsylvania, about her mother's garden, about the summer when she was a girl and the creek behind their house ran so full you could wade in it up to your knees. She did not tell him that the creek was gone now, that the house was gone, that everyone she had known there was gone or dead or had forgotten her. By late October, the chickens were gone too. Sarah had kept them in a small coop beside the cabin, but one night something, a fox, a weasel she never knew, got in and killed them both. She found them in the morning, their bodies torn apart, feathers scattered across the frozen ground. She stood there for a long time, staring at the blood in the snow. Then she went inside and told the children they were having chicken for supper. She plucked the birds herself, her hands shaking from cold and anger and something close to despair. She boiled them in the only pot she had, and the smell filled the cabin, rich, almost unbearable. The children ate until their bellies were full for the first time in weeks, and Sarah watched them and felt the tears burn behind her eyes. Because she knew this was the last full meal they would have for a long time. November came. The temperature dropped. The wind howled through the valley like something alive, rattling the cabin walls, finding every crack, every gap. Sarah stuffed rags into the spaces between the logs. She hung a blanket over the door to keep the draft out. She moved the children's bed as close to the fireplace as she dared, and still, they were cold. At night, she could hear Jacob's teeth chattering. She could feel Clara shivering beside her. She pulled them closer, wrapped them in every scrap of fabric she could find, and prayed they would make it to morning. The firewood was running low. Sarah knew it. She tried to stretch it, burning only enough to keep the cabin from freezing, letting the fire die down to embers at night and rebuilding it at dawn. But it wasn't enough. So she went out into the snow. The forest was a quarter mile from the cabin, and the drifts were deep. Sarah wrapped her feet in rags and tied them with twine, pulled Thomas's old coat over her dress, and pushed her way through the snow with a hatchet in her hand. It took her 2 hours to reach the trees. Another hour to find deadfall she could chop. Her hands were numb, her legs ached, her lungs burned from the thin, freezing air. But she filled her arms with wood and carried it back, one load at a time, her boots sinking into the snow with every step. Emma met her at the door, her face pale with worry. "Mama, you shouldn't—" "I'm fine," Sarah said, dropping the wood by the fireplace. "Watch your brother." She went back out. 3 more trips. 4. By the time she finished, the sun was setting, and her body was shaking so hard she could barely stand. She collapsed by the fire and let the heat soak into her skin, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Emma brought her a cup of water, melted snow, still cold. "Thank you," Sarah whispered. The girl sat beside her close enough that their shoulders touched. "Are we going to be all right?" Emma asked. Sarah looked at her daughter, 12 years old, too young to carry this kind of fear, too old to be lied to. "Yes," Sarah said, "we are." She didn't know if it was true, but she said it anyway, because sometimes a lie told with enough conviction becomes the only truth that matters. The snow kept falling, and the world outside the cabin disappeared entirely. December came like a door closing. The snow was no longer falling. It had simply become the world. The drifts reached the cabin windows, or would have if there had been windows. The cold was no longer something Sarah felt. It was something she carried inside her, a weight in her chest that never lifted. She woke each morning in the dark and lay still for a moment, listening for the sound of the children breathing, listening for the crackle of embers in the fireplace, listening for any sign that they had made it through another night. And then she would rise, her body stiff and aching, and begin again. By mid-December, the food was nearly gone. She had stretched it as far as it would go, but mathematics did not care about determination. 4 children needed to eat, and there was almost nothing left. She boiled the last of the beans with snow water and a pinch of salt. She divided it into 5 bowls, each portion barely enough to cover the bottom. Clara stared at hers and said nothing. Jacob pushed his away and said he wasn't hungry. "Eat," Sarah said. "I don't want it." "Jacob, eat." He looked up at her, his eyes large and dark in his thin face. "You eat it, Mama." Something broke inside her, something small and quiet, like a branch snapping under the weight of snow. She knelt down in front of him and took his face in her hands. "Listen to me," she said softly. "You are going to eat, and you are going to be strong, and you are going to live. Do you understand?" He nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks. She kissed his forehead and put the bowl back in his hands. He ate. That night, after the children were asleep, Sarah sat by the fire and tried to think, tried to plan, tried to find a way forward that did not end in starvation or surrender. She thought about the 15 miles to Leadville. The road was impassable now, buried under snow that would not melt until spring. Even if she tried to walk it, even if she left the children behind and went alone, she would not make it. The cold would kill her before she reached the valley. She thought about the Larsons, 3 miles away. But 3 miles in winter might as well be 30. And even if she made it to their door, what would she say? "We are starving. Help us." She had no money, no way to repay them. And charity, she had learned, always came with a price. She thought about Thomas. Wondered where he was. Wondered if he was alive. Wondered if he ever thought about the family he had left behind in the snow. And then she stopped thinking about him, because it didn't matter. He was gone. And she was here. She fed another log into the fire and watched the flames climb. The next morning, Emma woke with a cough. It was small at first, just a tickle in her throat, a slight rasp when she spoke. Sarah told her to stay close to the fire, to drink warm water, to rest. But by evening, the cough had deepened. By the next morning, it had spread to Clara, and by the 3rd day, it had reached Daniel. Sarah felt the fear move through her like ice water. She knew what a winter cough could become. She had seen it before, in Leadville, in the boarding houses where children slept 3 to a bed and sickness spread like wildfire. Pneumonia, influenza, croup. Any of them could kill a child in a matter of days. She had no medicine, no doctor, no way to get help. She did the only things she could do. She boiled water and held the pot near the children so they could breathe the steam. She kept the fire burning day and night, even though it meant the firewood was disappearing faster than she could replace it. She made them drink, even when they didn't want to, forcing warm water past their cracked lips. And she prayed. Not the formal prayers she had learned as a girl, recited in church with her head bowed and her hands folded. These were raw, desperate prayers, whispered into the dark while the children slept. "Please, please, please." She did not know who she was praying to. She did not know if anyone was listening. But she prayed anyway. Emma's fever broke after 4 days. She woke one morning pale and weak, but the cough had loosened and her eyes were clear. Sarah held her and felt the relief crash over her like a wave. Clara took longer, a week. Her fever spiked and fell and spiked again, and there were moments when Sarah thought she would lose her. But the girl was stubborn. She fought, and slowly, slowly, she began to heal. But Daniel did not improve. The baby, not quite a baby anymore, but still so small, still so fragile, burned with fever. His cough was wet and rattling, his breathing shallow and fast. Sarah held him against her chest and felt the heat radiating from his skin, felt the way his small body trembled with every breath. She did not sleep. She sat by the fire with Daniel in her arms, rocking him, singing to him, begging him to hold on. Emma and Clara watched from the bed, their faces pale and frightened. "Mama," Clara whispered. Is he going to die? Sarah looked at her daughter. 9 years old, too young to ask that question, too young to know the answer. No, Sarah said, he is not going to die. But she did not know if that was true. On the 5th night, Daniel's breathing changed. It became slower, weaker. Sarah could feel his heartbeat against her palm, fast and fluttering like a bird. She stood up and carried him closer to the fire, holding him in the warmth, whispering his name over and over. Daniel, Daniel, stay with me, stay. The children were asleep. The cabin was silent except for the crackle of the fire and the thin, rattling sound of the baby's breath. Sarah felt the edges of herself begin to fray, felt the exhaustion and the fear and the hunger all pressing in at once, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. She thought about the 15 miles to Leadville. She thought about strapping Daniel to her chest and walking through the snow, stumbling through the drifts, her body giving out halfway there and both of them freezing to death on the side of the mountain. She thought about staying, about doing everything she could with what little she had, about the terrible gamble of trusting her own hands when there was no one else to trust. And she made her choice. She stayed. She held her son. She kept him warm. She forced water past his lips, drop by drop. She prayed and worked and refused to let go. And sometime near dawn, when the fire had burned down to embers and the cold was creeping back into the cabin, Daniel's fever broke. His breathing steadied, his skin cooled, and when Sarah pressed her lips to his forehead, she felt the dampness of sweat instead of the dry burn of fever. She closed her eyes and let the tears come. She did not cry for long. There was no time. There was still wood to gather, still mouths to feed, still another day to survive. But for just a moment she let herself feel it. The relief, the gratitude, the overwhelming bone-deep exhaustion of having carried this weight and not broken beneath it. Emma woke and saw her mother sitting by the fire holding Daniel, her face streaked with tears. "Mama." Sarah looked up. "He's all right," she said quietly. "He's going to be all right." Emma came and sat beside her, resting her head on Sarah's shoulder. They sat together in the cold dawn light, the fire slowly dying, the snow still falling outside. And they did not speak. Because there were no words for what they had just survived, only the silence, and the knowledge that it was not over yet. January arrived without ceremony. The days were shorter now, the light pale and weak, as if the sun itself had grown tired of fighting the cold. Sarah marked the passage of time by scratching lines into the cabin wall with a piece of charcoal. 1 line for each day, grouped in sets of 7. She had lost count somewhere in December, but she started again. It gave her something to hold on to, something to measure. Daniel recovered slowly. He was thinner now, his cheeks hollow, his legs unsteady when he tried to walk. But he was alive, and that was enough. The food was gone. Sarah had known it was coming. She had rationed and stretched and divided until there was nothing left to divide. The last spoonful of cornmeal had been eaten 3 days ago. The preserves were gone. The potatoes were gone. Even the lard, which she had saved for emergencies, had been scraped from the bottom of the jar and mixed with snow water to make a thin, tasteless gruel. There was nothing left. She stood in the cabin and looked at the empty shelves, the bare table, the children sitting quietly by the fire with hunger in their eyes, and she felt the weight of it settle over her like a shroud. She had kept them alive this long, but she could not keep them alive on air. She needed food, and there was only one place to get it. That afternoon, Sarah wrapped herself in Thomas's coat and told Emma to watch the children. The girl looked up at her with wide, worried eyes. "Where are you going?" "To the Larsons." "Mama, you can't walk 3 miles in this. I'll be fine." "Mama." Sarah knelt down and took Emma's hands in hers. "Listen to me. Keep the fire going. Do not let it go out. If I'm not back by dark, add 1 more log, only 1, do you understand?" Emma nodded, her jaw tight. Sarah kissed her forehead and stood. She picked up the empty burlap sack she had brought from Pennsylvania all those years ago. the same sack that had once held flour and beans and hope, and slung it over her shoulder. Then she opened the door and stepped out into the cold. The wind hit her immediately, sharp and cutting. The snow was not falling, but the drifts were deep, and the path she had walked a month ago was long gone. She pushed forward, her legs sinking with each step, the cold seeping through the rags wrapped around her boots. It took her nearly 2 hours to reach the Larsens' cabin. She stood outside for a moment, catching her breath, her lungs burning. The cabin was small but solid, smoke rising steadily from the chimney. She could hear voices inside, laughter, the sound of a normal life continuing, uninterrupted. She knocked. The door opened, and Mrs. Larsen stood there, a stout woman with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her expression shifted when she saw Sarah. Surprise, then something else. Discomfort, maybe, or pity. "Mrs. Harmon," she said carefully. "Mrs. Larsen." Sarah's voice was hoarse. "I apologize for the intrusion. I need to ask a favor." Mrs. Larsen glanced over her shoulder, then stepped outside, pulling the door partly closed behind her. "What is it?" Sarah swallowed. This was harder than she had thought it would be. Harder than chopping wood in the freezing cold. Harder than holding a sick child through the night. "My husband is gone," she said quietly. "I have 4 children. We've been snowed in since October, and we're out of food." Mrs. Larsen's face did not change. "I'm not asking for charity," Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I can work. I can sew, mend, wash, whatever you need. I just need enough to get us through to spring. Flour, beans, anything you can spare, I'll pay you back, I swear it." Mrs. Larsen was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll speak to my husband." She went back inside, closing the door. Sarah stood in the snow and waited. The cold pressed in around her. Her feet were numb, her fingers ached. She could hear voices inside the cabin, low, murmuring, impossible to make out. And then the door opened again. Mr. Larsen stood there, a tall man with a thick beard and hard eyes. He looked Sarah up and down, his expression unreadable. "We don't have much ourselves," he said. "I understand," Sarah said quickly. "Anything you can spare. And we can't be taking in every family that didn't prepare proper for winter." The words landed like stones. Sarah felt her throat tighten. "I'm not asking you to take us in. I'm asking for help. Just enough to—" "You got a husband?" "He's gone." "Gone where?" "I don't know." Mr. Larsen shook his head slowly. "That's a hard situation, Mrs. Harmon. But it's not our situation." Sarah stared at him. "I have 4 children, and we have our own to think about. I'm offering to work. We don't need work. We need to get through winter same as you." Mrs. Larsen appeared behind her husband, her face tight with something that might have been guilt, but she said nothing. Sarah stood there, the empty sack hanging from her shoulder, and felt the last thread of hope snap inside her. "Please," she said, and hated the sound of her own voice. Mr. Larsen looked uncomfortable now. He glanced at his wife, then back at Sarah. "I'm sorry," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "We can't help you." And he closed the door. Sarah stood in the snow for a long time, staring at the closed door, the smoke rising from the chimney, the warm glow of lamplight visible through the cracks. Then she turned and walked away. The journey back was slower. Her legs felt heavy, her body drained of whatever strength had carried her this far. The wind picked up and the cold bit deeper, and she stumbled more than once, catching herself on her hands, the snow burning her skin. She thought about lying down, just for a moment, just to rest. But she kept walking, because 4 children were waiting for her, and if she stopped, if she gave in, they would have no one. By the time she reached the cabin, the sun was setting, the sky streaked with red and orange. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, her body shaking uncontrollably. Emma looked up from the fire. "Mama," Sarah held up a hand. "I'm fine." But she wasn't. She collapsed onto the floor, her legs giving out, and Emma rushed to her side. Clara and Jacob crowded close, their faces pale with fear. "Did you get food?" Jacob asked, his voice small. Sarah looked at him, at all of them, at the hope in their eyes. And she lied. "Not yet," she said, "but I will." That night after the children were asleep, Sarah sat by the dying fire and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. She had begged, she had humbled herself, she had offered everything she had to give, and it had not been enough. The community knew she was here, they knew she had children, they knew she was alone. And they had chosen to do nothing. She understood in a distant, abstract way why. People had their own problems, their own families, their own winter to survive. Helping her meant risking themselves, and risk was a luxury no one could afford, but understanding did not make it easier. She looked at the children, sleeping in a pile by the fire, their small bodies tangled together for warmth. Emma's arm was wrapped protectively around Daniel. Clara's hand rested on Jacob's back. They trusted her. They believed she would keep them safe, and she had nothing left to give them. She thought about the spring, about the snow melting and the roads opening and the possibility of finding work, finding help, finding some way forward. But spring was months away, and the children needed to eat now. She stood and walked to the door, opening it just enough to look out at the frozen landscape. The stars were bright and cold overhead. The mountains loomed black against the sky. Somewhere out there, Thomas was alive or dead. Somewhere out there, people were warm and fed and safe. And here, she was alone with 4 children and an empty cabin, and a choice that was not really a choice at all. She could give up. She could walk away. She could take the children to town and beg someone to take them, to feed them, to save them from her failure. Or she could stay and fight and find a way to survive with nothing but her own 2 hands and the refusal to break. She closed the door. She fed the last log into the fire, and she made her decision. She would not give up. She would not surrender. She would not let them win. The valley wanted her to fail. The snow wanted to bury her. The cold wanted to break her. But she was still standing. And as long as she was standing, her children would live. She did not know how. She did not have a plan. But she would find a way. Because the alternative was unthinkable. The hunger became a living thing. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself with pain or panic. It simply settled into the cabin like another occupant, quiet and patient, waiting. Sarah felt it first in the mornings, a hollow ache that made her dizzy when she stood. Then in the afternoons, when her hands trembled as she tried to work. Then at night, when sleep would not come because her stomach cramped and twisted, demanding what she could not give. The children felt it too. Jacob stopped asking for food. Clara became quiet, her eyes too large in her thinning face. Even Emma, who tried so hard to be strong, moved slowly now, as if her body were too heavy to carry. Only Daniel seemed unaware. He cried sometimes, reaching for Sarah with small, desperate hands, and she would hold him and rock him and whisper lies about tomorrow. Sarah began to forage. She went out into the snow every day, searching for anything edible. She dug beneath the drifts looking for frozen roots. She stripped bark from trees and boiled it into a bitter pulp that burned the throat going down. She found rose hips, shriveled and frozen, and divided them among the children like precious stones. It was not enough. It was never enough. But it was something. One afternoon in late January, she was digging near the tree line when she found animal tracks in the snow. Rabbit, maybe. Or fox. She followed them for nearly an hour, her breath coming in short gasps, her vision blurring at the edges. But the tracks disappeared into a thicket she could not penetrate, and she turned back, empty-handed, the disappointment sharp as a blade. When she returned to the cabin, Emma was waiting by the door, her face pale. Jacob won't wake up. Sarah felt her heart stop. She pushed past Emma and knelt beside the bed where Jacob lay, his small body curled beneath the blankets. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. "Jacob," she said, shaking his shoulder gently. "Jacob, wake up." He stirred but did not open his eyes. She touched his face. His skin was cold, clammy. His lips had a faint blue tinge. Starvation. He was shutting down. Sarah's mind went blank with terror, and then just as quickly it sharpened into focus. She built up the fire until it roared. She heated water and forced Jacob to drink, tipping his head back, pouring it slowly into his mouth. She stripped bark and boiled it with the last handful of rose hips, creating a thin, bitter tea that might have some small amount of nourishment. She worked through the night, Emma at her side, the two of them taking turns holding Jacob, keeping him warm, keeping him awake. By morning, his eyes opened. He looked at Sarah with a confusion that broke her heart. "Mama?" "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm here." He lived. But Sarah understood now that time was running out. The children were not going to survive on bark and frozen berries. They needed real food, protein, fat, calories, and there was only one way to get it. The next morning, Sarah told Emma to stay inside with the children. She took Thomas's old rifle down from the wall, a battered single-shot weapon he had bought years ago and rarely used, and checked the chamber. There were 3 bullets left. 3 chances. She had never been a good shot. Thomas had tried to teach her once, but she had no patience for it, and he had given up. Now she wished she had listened. She stepped outside into the blinding white landscape and began to walk. The forest was silent. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of her boots in the snow and the sound of her own breathing. She walked for an hour before she saw movement. A deer. A young doe, thin from winter, standing motionless at the edge of a clearing. Sarah's hands were shaking as she raised the rifle. She had never killed anything larger than a chicken. She did not know if she could do this, but she thought of Jacob's cold face. She thought of Daniel's cry. She thought of Emma's hollow eyes, and she pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the silence, and the deer bolted. Sarah ran forward, her legs sinking in the snow, her heart pounding. She searched for blood, for any sign that she had hit it. Nothing. She had missed. She stood there, the rifle heavy in her hands, and felt the tears burn hot against her frozen cheeks. 2 bullets left. She walked for another hour, and then another. The cold gnawed at her and the hunger made her weak, but she kept moving. She saw tracks. She saw scat. But she saw no animals. The sun was beginning to set when she finally saw it. A rabbit, small and gray, sitting perfectly still beneath a pine tree. Sarah stopped breathing. She raised the rifle slowly, carefully, her hands steadier this time. She aimed. She squeezed the trigger. The rabbit fell. Sarah ran forward and grabbed it, clutching the warm body to her chest. It was small, barely 3 pounds, but it was food. She carried it back to the cabin, her legs burning, her lungs aching, her vision swimming. When she pushed open the door, the children looked up. Emma saw the rabbit and burst into tears. That night, Sarah skinned and gutted the rabbit by the firelight, her hands shaking with exhaustion. She saved every scrap, the meat, the organs, even the bones for broth. She cooked it slowly, carefully, stretching it as far as it would go. The children ate. For the first time in weeks, they ate real food, and Sarah watched them and felt something loosen in her chest. It was not victory, it was not safety, but it was a reprieve, and sometimes that was enough. February came. The rabbit was gone within 3 days. Sarah went out hunting again, but the forest was empty. Whatever animals had survived the winter were hidden, conserved, waiting. She set snares made from wire Thomas had left behind, but they caught nothing. She tried ice fishing in the frozen creek, chopping through 6 inches of ice with the hatchet, but the water was too shallow, the fish too scarce. She came back empty-handed every time. The children grew weaker. Clara stopped getting out of bed unless she had to. Jacob slept most of the day. Even Emma, who had been Sarah's rock, her steady presence began to falter. One night, Sarah woke to find Emma sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. "Mama," she said quietly, "are we going to die?" Sarah sat beside her. She wanted to say no. She wanted to promise her daughter that everything would be fine, that help was coming, that they would survive this. but she had no more lies left. "I don't know," she said. Emma nodded slowly. "I'm not afraid," she said. "I just don't want the little ones to be scared." Sarah pulled her daughter close and held her, and they sat together in the firelight, the wind howling outside, the cold pressing in. And Sarah made a promise, not to God, not to the world, but to herself. She would not let them die afraid. She would not let them die alone. If the end came, it would come with her holding them, whispering that they were loved, that they had been brave, that they had fought. But she would fight until there was nothing left to fight with. The next morning, she went out again. This time, she did not go to the forest. She went to the cabin's foundation, to the small root cellar Thomas had dug years ago, a hole barely 4 feet deep, covered with planks and dirt. She had avoided it all winter, knowing it was empty, knowing there was nothing there. But desperation makes people thorough. She pried up the planks and climbed down into the dark, frozen space. She ran her hands along the dirt walls, searching, hoping. And in the far corner, half buried in the frozen earth, she found it. A sack. She pulled it free, her hands numb, and carried it up into the light. Inside were potatoes. Old, sprouted, half-rotten. But potatoes. Enough for a week, maybe 2 if she was careful. Sarah knelt in the snow and laughed. A wild, broken sound that turned into sobs. She carried the sack inside and set it on the table. The children stared. "Where did you find those?" Emma whispered. "It doesn't matter," Sarah said. "We have food." She sorted through them, cutting away the rotten parts, saving everything she could. That night they ate boiled potatoes, and the cabin smelled like hope. But Sarah knew the truth. This was the last of it. When these were gone, there would be nothing. Spring had to come soon. It had to, because they had nothing left. March came quietly. The snow was still deep, the cold still brutal, but there was something different in the air. A softness at the edges of the wind, a brightness to the light that had not been there before. The sun stayed above the horizon a little longer each day, and Sarah began to mark the change the way a drowning person marks the surface of the water. Spring was coming, but it was not here yet. The potatoes lasted 12 days. Sarah rationed them with a ruthlessness that frightened even herself, dividing each one into portions so small they barely filled a palm. The children ate without complaint, their bodies too weak now for anything but acceptance. Daniel had stopped crying. That was what scared her most. He sat in Sarah's lap, quiet and still, his eyes half closed, his breathing shallow. He was 2 years old, and he had stopped fighting. Clara could no longer walk without help. Her legs trembled when she stood, and her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that made Sarah's chest tighten with fear. Jacob slept most of the time, his small body curled into a ball, conserving whatever energy he had left. Only Emma remained upright, moving through the cabin like a ghost, tending the fire, helping Sarah when she could. But even Emma was fading. Her hands shook constantly now. Her eyes had sunk deep into her face. Sarah looked at her children and understood that they were dying. Not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But soon. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. On the 15th of March, Sarah made a decision. She would walk to Leadville. It was madness. 15 miles through snow that still stood waist-deep in places. 15 miles with no food in her stomach and no strength in her legs. The odds of her making it were slim. The odds of her surviving the return journey were even slimmer. But staying meant watching her children die slowly, one by one, while she sat helpless beside them. And that was a death she could not accept. She told Emma that evening, after the younger children had fallen asleep, "I'm going to town tomorrow." Emma looked up from the fire, her face pale. "Mama, you can't. The snow. I have to. You'll die out there." "Maybe," Sarah said quietly. "But if I stay here, we all die. This way, there's a chance." Emma's jaw tightened. "Then I'm coming with you." "No, Mama. Someone has to stay with them," Sarah said. nodding toward the bed where Clara, Jacob, and Daniel lay tangled together under the blankets. "If I don't make it back, you're all they have." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she did not argue. Sarah reached out and took her daughter's hand. "If I'm not back in 3 days," she said, her voice steady, "you take them down the mountain. You follow the road. You find help. Do you understand?" Emma nodded, her face crumpling. "You're stronger than you know," Sarah whispered. "You always have been." That night, Sarah did not sleep. She sat by the fire and watched her children, memorizing their faces, the rise and fall of their chests, the small sounds they made in their sleep. She thought about the life she had imagined when she married Thomas, the home they would build, the future they would create. How far away it all seemed now. How naive she had been. But she did not regret coming west. She did not regret the cabin or the struggle or the loneliness, because she had them, these 4 small lives that depended on her. And if she died tomorrow on the road to Leadville, at least she would die trying to save them. That was more than most people could say. At dawn, she dressed in every layer she owned. Thomas's coat, 2 shawls, rags wrapped around her hands and feet. She took the rifle, though she had no bullets left. It might be useful as a walking stick. Emma stood by the door, her face pale and set. "Come back," she said. Sarah kissed her forehead. "I will." She opened the door and stepped out into the cold. The first mile was agony. Her legs were weak, her body half-starved, and the snow was deep. She fell twice in the first hour, her face hitting the frozen ground, her lungs burning as she struggled to stand. But she kept moving. By midday, she had covered 3 miles. Her vision was blurring at the edges, and she could no longer feel her feet. But the road was still visible beneath the snow, a faint depression winding down through the valley. She followed it. At some point, she began to see things that were not there. Thomas, standing at the edge of the trees, watching her. Her mother, walking beside her, whispering encouragement. The children, small and laughing, running ahead through the snow. She knew they were not real, but they kept her company. By late afternoon, she crested a rise and saw smoke in the distance. Leadville. She started to cry, not from relief, from exhaustion, from the sheer overwhelming weight of having made it this far. She stumbled down the slope, her legs barely holding her, and by the time she reached the outskirts of town, the sun was setting. She did not remember the walk to the general store, did not remember pushing open the door or collapsing onto the floor inside, but she remembered the voice of the shopkeeper, a man named Henderson, kneeling beside her. "Good God, woman, what happened to you?" She tried to speak, but the words would not come. He carried her to a back room and gave her water. Bread. She ate slowly, her stomach cramping, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the cup. "My children," she finally managed. "I have 4 children, 15 miles up the mountain, no food, please." Henderson stared at her. "You walked 15 miles? In this?" She nodded. "Alone?" "Yes." He shook his head, something like awe in his expression. "I'll get supplies together. First light, I'll take a wagon up." "Tonight," Sarah said. "Please, they're dying." "Ma'am, I can't get a wagon through that snow in the dark. I'll break an axle, or worse. First light, I promise." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to scream, but her body was done. She had nothing left. She nodded. Henderson gave her a bed in the back room, but she did not sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the hours until dawn, and praying that her children would last one more night. The wagon left at sunrise. Henderson drove, and Sarah sat beside him, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, her body aching from the previous day's journey. The trip back took 6 hours. The snow was beginning to soften in places, the first sign of the thaw, but the road was still brutal. When they finally reached the cabin, Sarah climbed down before the wagon had fully stopped and ran to the door. She pushed it open. Emma was sitting by the fire, holding Daniel. Clara and Jacob were asleep on the bed. They were alive, all of them. Emma looked up, and when she saw her mother, she started to cry. Sarah crossed the room and pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her tight. "I told you I'd come back," she whispered. Henderson brought in the supplies: flour, beans, salt pork, dried apples, coffee. More than Sarah had seen in months. He set them on the table and looked around the cabin, his face grim. "How long have you been like this?" he asked. "Since October," Sarah said quietly. He shook his head. "And no one came to check on you?" "No." Henderson was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I'll spread the word in town, make sure people know." Sarah did not respond. She did not care what people knew. She did not care what they thought. She cared only that her children were alive. After Henderson left, Sarah cooked a real meal: beans with salt pork, bread made from fresh flour. The children ate slowly, carefully, their bodies still too weak for excess. But they ate, and Sarah watched them and felt something she had not felt in months. Not happiness, not relief, but survival. She had done it. She had kept them alive. The snow began to melt in earnest a week later. The drifts shrank. The road reappeared, and slowly the world opened back up. People came. Neighbors who had ignored her all winter suddenly appeared with offerings: a sack of cornmeal, a jar of preserves, a dressed chicken. Mrs. Larson came too, her face tight with something that might have been shame. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "We should have helped." Sarah looked at her for a long moment. Then she took the offered food and said, "Thank you." She did not forgive, but she did not refuse. By April, the valley was green again. Sarah planted a garden, her hands still weak but steady. The children grew stronger. Color returned to their faces. Laughter returned to the cabin. And Sarah began to plan. She would stay through summer. She would harvest what she could, save what she could. And then, before the next winter came, she would leave. She would take the children and find a place where survival did not mean fighting every single day. But for now, she stayed. And when people in the valley saw her, walking to town, working her land, tending her children, they no longer looked away. They nodded, respectfully, quietly, because they had seen what she had done. They had seen what she had survived. And they knew, even if they never said it aloud, that Sarah Harmon was stronger than any of them. She had faced winter alone with 4 children and nothing but her own will. And she had won. Not because she was saved, not because help had come in time, but because she had refused to break. And in the end, that refusal was the only thing that mattered. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is not the grand gesture or the dramatic sacrifice. Sometimes it is simply waking up one more morning, feeding the fire one more time, taking one more step when every part of you is screaming to stop. Sarah Harmon did that, every day, for 5 months, and her children lived because of it. Have you ever had to choose between 2 impossible things? Between risking everything and losing everything? Have you ever had to be strong when there was no one left to be strong for you? Share your story in the comments. I read everyone.